Chapter 7. Between the moral law and the superego. The quantum of affect. In Kantian theory, the moral law and the ethical subject meet on two different levels. The first level is that of the signifier, the level of the categorical imperative, of the formulation of the moral law. So far, we have primarily been interrogating this aspect of Kantian ethics and the role that the subject plays in the formulation and realization of the moral law. The other level of the encounter between the subject and the moral law is of quite a different kind, the level of the affect. The moral law affects the subject, and this results in a very singular feeling that Kant calls respect, Achtung. Kant's theory of respect displays, in its own way, the fundamental ambiguities of his ethics, especially his oscillation between two different portraits of the moral law, the unconditional yet void moral law, and the somehow subjectivized law of the superego. Kant examines the unique feeling he calls Achtung, respect, in the third chapter of the Critique of Practical Reason, of the drives of pure practical reason. Respect, as he attempts to show, is the only feeling that characterizes the subject's relation to the moral law. Respect for the moral law does not mean respecting the law, nor does it mean having respect for the law. Rather, it is a feeling which indicates that the law is nearby. It indicates the presence of the moral law, the subject's close encounter with the moral law. Kant offers an elaborate account of this feeling, an account which shows that his sense of the term respect has nothing whatsoever to do with our ordinary usage of the term. In his explanation, Kant detaches it from other feelings that may seem to resemble it, but are in fact of a very different nature. The feelings of inclination, love, fear, admiration, wonder, and awe. It has already been suggested that the Kantian notion of respect might be situated in the same register as the psychoanalytic, or rather Lacanian, notion of anxiety. In fact, if we examine Kant's discussion of the feeling of respect, this kinship is quite strikingly confirmed. The starting point of Kant's argument in this chapter is the following question. How is it possible for the moral law to be the direct incentive of the will? How is it possible for something that cannot be an object of representation, Vorstellung, to determine our will and become the drive behind our actions? Kant's answer is that this is an insoluble problem for human reason. However, he goes on to say that if it is not possible to show how such a thing is possible, we can at least prove that it must exist, that it actually happens, that the moral law directly determines the will. We can prove that this happens because of the effect it produces. And it is this effect that Kant conceives of in the terms of the feeling of respect. The feeling of respect is evidence that something that is not an object of representation can nevertheless determine the will. According to Kant, respect is a singular feeling which cannot be compared with any pathological feeling. It is of such a peculiar kind that it seems to be at the disposal only of reason, and indeed only of pure practical reason. The feeling of respect is not a pathological but a practical feeling. It is not of empirical origin but is known a priori. It is not the drive to morality, it is morality itself. In order to grasp fully what is at stake here, and to understand what impels Kant to call respect an a priori and non-pathological feeling, we must bear in mind Kant's theory of what and how something can be a cause of our actions. This theory is best summarized in these sentences. Quote, "Life is the faculty of a being by which it acts according to the laws of the faculty of desire. The faculty of desire is the faculty such a being has of causing, through its representations, Vorstellungen, the reality of the objects of this representation." End of quote. In other words, human actions are governed by the law of the faculty of desire. This faculty implies a representation of a certain object, which might very well be abstract. Things such as shame, honor, fame, approval of others are all objects of representation in the required sense. The subject is affected by a certain representation, and this affection is both the cause of her actions and, at the same time, the reason why her actions are determined pathologically. Now, the problem is that this does not leave any room for morality, since the latter, by its very definition, excludes all pathological motives for our actions, even the most noble ones. The difficulty, which Kant tries to resolve in the chapter of the drives of pure practical reason, thus consists in finding and articulating another type of causality, one that is foreign to the mode of representation. As we have seen, Kant finds this problem an insoluble problem of human reason, yet simultaneously a problem that is in some way always already solved in any ethical action. The solution lies in what he calls respect, and describes as the only drive of pure practical reason. The avant la lettre Lacanian intent of Kant's conception of the difference between desire, Begehrung, and drive, Triebfeder, is striking here. While desire essentially belongs to the mode of representation, the metonymy of the signifier on the one hand, fantasy on the other, the logic of the drive is quite different. When Lacan asserts that the drive attains its satisfaction without attaining its goal, this means precisely that the object of drive is not an object of representation. It is not the object we aim at, the object we want to obtain, our goal. The object of the drive coincides with the itinerary of the drive, and is not something that this itinerary intends to attain. In other words, the object of the drive is not an object supposed to provide some satisfaction to the subject, but this satisfaction itself. The object of the drive is satisfaction as object. This, as we have just seen, is exactly how Kant defines respect. It is not the drive to morality, it is morality itself. Respect is thus the irreducible quantum of affect that emerges on the part of the subject. It is nothing but the final residue of the pathological, which, in fact, is no longer pathological in the strict sense of the word. Respect is the other name of what we earlier called ethical transubstantiation, the conversion of the form of the law into a drive. At first sight, this seems to imply that respect is linked to a lack of representation, i.e., to the fact that the moral law, as noumenal, cannot become an object of representation, and that it is this lack or void that engenders respect. Yet, if we examine this situation more closely, we soon realize that it is not simply that the absence of representation gives rise to the feeling of respect. What gives rise to the feeling of respect is the absence of something constitutive of the subject of representation. In Kant's theory, the constitution of the subject of representation coincides with a certain loss. The subject loses, so to speak, that which she never had, direct, immediate access to herself. This is the whole point of Kant's critique of Descartes' cogito. The subject who coincides entirely with herself is not yet a subject, and once she becomes a subject, she no longer coincides with herself, but can only speak of herself as of an object. The subject's relation to herself does not allow her any shortcut. It is of the same kind as the subject's relation to all other objects of representation. The I is just a thought, a representation like any other representation. The fundamental loss, or alienation, this implies, is the condition of the thinking subject, the subject who has thoughts and representations. It is this loss that opens up objective reality, phenomenal reality, and allows the subject to conceive herself as subject. In Lacanian terms, a little piece of the real necessarily falls out in the constitution of the subject. Thus, the cause of the singular feeling Kant calls respect is not simply the absence of representation, but the absence, of this lack, which could provide a support for the subject of representation. Representation itself is founded on a certain lack or loss, and it is this lack that falls short. This situation is precisely that of a lack that comes to lack, a lack that runs out. And this is exactly Lacan's definition of the cause of anxiety. Le manquer vie à manquer. Lack of lack. The feeling of respect seizes us when the law becomes visible in an exemplary case of ethical action. What becomes visible in this way is precisely the absence of a cause for such an action. The Kantian notion of respect and the Lacanian notion of anxiety have this in common. They do not have a cause, but they have an object. We might even say that this lack of a cause correlates with the emergence of the object. If the moral law determines our will immediately, this means that something detaches itself from the chain of causality and begins to function as object. As long as it stays thus detached, it arouses respect or anxiety. It arouses the discomfort which manifests itself in the fact that we seek, as Kant puts it, to discover something that will lighten the burden of it for us, some fault to compensate us for the humiliation which we suffer from such an example. Even the moral law itself, he adds, is subject to this attempt to keep oneself from yielding respect to it. It is clear that this attempt aims at reattaching to the causal chain the thing that seems to be detached from it, wandering around without the cause. Thus we seek, for example, to discover a pathological motive for an action which seems purely ethical. In exactly the same way as Kant defines respect here, we find Lacan defining anxiety as an affect or feeling fundamentally at odds with all other feelings. Lacan places himself in opposition to the theory which claims that anxiety differs from fear, in that anxiety, unlike fear, does not have an object. According to this theory, when we are afraid, it is always of something, whereas with anxiety, there is no object we can point to and say, this is the object of my anxiety. Lacan claims that, on the contrary, it is in anxiety that the subject comes closest to the object, i.e., to the real kernel of his jouissance. and that it is precisely this proximity of the object which lies at the origin of anxiety. This claim cannot be explained away by a reference to the specific Lacanian sense of the term object. We should say, rather, that it is Lacan's conception of anxiety that explains the specific sense of the word object in his terminology. In this way of distinguishing between fear and anxiety, Lacan basically agrees with Kant. Fear is a feeling like any other feeling. It is subjective and pathological. The fact that we fear some object tells us nothing about this object. It does not mean that this object is, in itself, i.e., as an object of representation, something horrible. Or, as Kant puts it, a feeling, Gefühl, designates nothing whatsoever in the object. There is no feeling without a representation. That is to say, representation is a necessary condition of feeling, although feeling itself is not yet a representation of an object. A feeling is the way the subject feels himself, namely, how he is affected by the representation. Lacan would say that the feeling tells us nothing about the object. It tells us something about the subject's window of fantasy, in the frame of which a certain object appears terrifying. Now, as with respect in Kantian theory, in Lacanian theory, anxiety is not a subjective, but rather an objective feeling. It is a feeling which does not deceive, one which indicates that we have come near to the object, designating the estimate place of our jouissance. If we do not bear in mind this objective, objectal character of a certain subjective experience, we may find ourselves in the position of the analyst in the well-known joke. A patient comes to see him, complaining that a crocodile is hiding under his bed. During several sessions, the analyst tries to persuade the patient that this is all in his imagination. In other words, he tries to persuade him that it is all about a purely subjective feeling. The patient stops seeing the analyst, who believes he has cured him. A month later, the analyst meets a friend, who is also a friend of his ex-patient, and asks him how the latter is. The friend answers, "Do you mean the one who was eaten by a crocodile?" The lesson of this story is profoundly Lacanian. If we start from the idea that anxiety does not have an object, what are we then to call this thing which killed, which ate the subject? What is the subject telling the analyst in this joke? Nothing other than, I have the objet petit a under my bed. I came too close to it. In order to drive this point home further, we can also link it to the Lacanian notion of the drive. Anxiety is the way the subject experiences the drive, the surplus satisfaction produced in its circuit. That part of satisfaction that the drive finds beyond the subject. We have already mentioned Kant's remark that we tend to defend ourselves against the feeling of respect and strive to lighten the burden it lays upon us. Yet the question must nevertheless arise as to whether Kant's conception of respect does not, at a certain point, take the path that really represents a defense against the real dimension of respect. As a matter of fact, Kant does reintroduce the dimension of representation, which will allow the subject to recover, to regain consciousness. This other direction of Kant's conception of respect involves conceiving it in terms of a consciousness of a free submission to the will of the law. A new representation comes in here, and respect becomes respect for the moral law as it is manifest in this representation. Respect is no longer the affect that produces the moral law in us, directly determining the will, it becomes instead a representation of this effect. Quote, the thing, the representation of which, as determining principle of our will, humiliates us in our self-consciousness, provokes respect. End of quote. In other words, what now arouses the feeling of respect is the fact that the subject sees herself as being subjected to the law and observes herself being humiliated and terrified. Kant writes, quote, in the boundless esteem for the pure moral law, whose voice makes even the boldest sinner tremble and forces him to hide himself from its gaze, there is something so singular that we cannot wonder at finding this influence of a merely intellectual idea on feeling to be inexplicable for speculative reason. End of quote. Here, respect is reformulated in terms of a boundless esteem for the moral law, linked to fear and horror which makes even the boldest sinner tremble. At this point, we are quite a long way from respect as an a priori feeling. Instead, we are dealing here with a law that both observes and speaks. It is difficult to understand how it happened that Kant could have overlooked the fact that, with this conceptualization, the feeling of respect turns into pure and simple Ehrfurcht, wonder, defined by Kant as respect linked to fear, thus becoming an ordinary, pathological motive. At the same time, this introduction of the voice and the gaze, the two Lacanian objects par excellence, is a result of a maneuver which aims to fill a hole in the other, the law, by means of supplementing the other by the object that it lacks, and the lack of which makes the other not whole. We have already argued that a certain inconsistency or incompleteness of the other, the moral law, is the very kernel of ethics. Yet Kant, in the passage just quoted, restores the absolute, complete, whole other by supplying it with a voice and a gaze. The trembling of someone who finds him herself before both the gaze and the voice of the law must not mislead us. This trembling is already a relief compared to the original feeling of respect. Fear is already a relief from the anxiety of respect. If we ask ourselves which law it is that speaks and observes, there is of course only one possible answer: the law of the superego. In the passage from the Critique of Practical Reason quoted above, we can clearly see how the moral law transforms itself into the law of the superego. It is the superego which, by definition, both sees everything and never ceases to speak, issuing one commandment after another. And this also explains another expression often used by Kant, an expression which is not entirely compatible with the strict conception of the moral law, that it humiliates us, and that the effect of this law on feeling is humiliation alone. We could in fact say that in the chapter in question, Kant actually introduces two different feelings linked to two different conceptions of the moral law: respect and humiliation. More precisely, respect as an a priori feeling, and the respect that springs from the consciousness of humiliation, or respect as a mode of anxiety, and respect as a mode of fantasy, where we observe ourselves being humiliated by the moral law. It is important to point out here that the institution of the superego, or the superegoization of the moral law, is strictly correlated with what might be called a fear of success. What is feared here is a certain "ce ne manque pas," a certain "it does not fail." The absolute other, in the form of the superego, is there in order to guarantee that there will always be lack on the other side, the side of the subject, that this lack will never run out, and that it, the act, will never succeed. If an accomplished or successful act is always related to the dimension of the lack that comes to lack, the superegoic version of the moral law focuses on preventing the act from even taking place. But the only real guarantee that can be fabricated to prevent the act from even taking place is the advent of the figure of an absolute other. If there is an other of the other, the very possibility of the act is excluded by definition. And such an exclusion, in spite of the humiliation and torment that the subject must endure at the hands of this other, is, in fact, pacifying. This shift of the moral law towards the superego is not without consequences. In fact, it governs the whole of the dialectic of the sublime. It also explains why Kant, who had previously established a clear distinction between respect and other feelings, such as wonder and awe, can conclude the second critique with the famous phrase, "Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing wonder and awe. The oftener and the more steadily we reflect on them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." This same identification provides the tone of the Critique of Judgment, 1799, and dictates, to a large extent, its procedure. As a matter of fact, the third critique could be said to accomplish the shift which was already announced in the Critique of Practical Reason. This shift concerns Kant's conceptualization of Achtung, respect, and it is symptomatic of a shift undergone by the concept of the moral law in Kant's work. In this shift, respect is degraded and situated on the same level as all other feelings. This shift had already been accomplished by the time of the Metaphysics of Morals, the doctrinaire presentation of Kantian moral philosophy, which appeared 2 years before the Critique of Judgment. If, in the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant dedicated a whole chapter to the notion of respect, the paragraph entitled Respect in the Metaphysics of Morals does not even get a whole page. Moreover, respect is defined in this paragraph as et fas blos subjectives, something merely subjective. Kant no longer speaks of an a priori and non-pathological feeling. The object of respect changes as well. In the Critique of Practical Reason, it is the moral law as such that constitutes the object of respect, whereas in the Metaphysics of Morals, we can already see the inversion which will govern the dialectic of the sublime in the third critique. This inversion is formulated as follows, quote, "The feeling of the sublime in nature is respect for our own vocation. But, by a certain subreption, this respect is accorded an object of nature that, as it were, makes intuitable for us the superiority of the rational vocation of our cognitive powers over the greatest power of sensibility."